Hi friends, welcome or welcome back to my channel. I really hope you're all doing well. It feels quite frankly bizarre to be coming at you again from this little corner with my books and my Christmas presents, and like, I don't know, it feels simultaneously like I've been away forever and like I've also only been away for about 2 minutes. For anyone who is new to my channel, this is my parents' house in the UK where I first started my booktube channel and first started filming before I moved to the US this summer, and I'm currently back for a few weeks for the holidays and my best friend just got married here. So obviously I wasn't going to miss that, so I flew back for that, and I'm having December in the UK and then flying back to my home in the States in a few weeks' time. So that's what we're doing here. But today I just wanted to film for you a video that I've had in mind for a while, but I wanted to be kind of reunited with my book collection back in the UK to be able to film it, because I want to talk to you guys about the books that kind of fundamentally changed who I am as a human and that affected me on kind of like a really deep level, very transformative, very integral to making me the human that I am today. And all of those books happened to be in the UK, so this was something that I've had to wait to film, but I'm really excited to film it. I just wish that I had a more aesthetic backdrop, but you know, this will do, this is fine. So I've kind of split the books into classics and modern classics, because I mean really there's no super modern contemporary literature that's going to fall into the categories of books that have changed me fundamentally. Obviously you guys know that I am absolutely obsessed with Sarah J Maas and I love her work, but she and her books I do not think fall into this category. Likewise, Magnolia Parks, absolutely loved it. It's taken over my life this year, but again I don't think it's responsible for making me the human that I am today. There is one fantasy series, one modern fantasy series that I would have put in this video, in this category, had the author turned out to not be a giant turf, and I think you will know what I'm talking about when I say that. So obviously, you know, that was a huge part of my childhood, reading that series, and definitely it gave me, you know, a love for, well, I always had a love for books. I've had a lifelong, very strong love affair with books and literature literally since I was about 2 years old, but that series was definitely a series that really captured my heart and captured my imagination as a kid. However, it's not something that I'm going to be promoting on this channel, so yes, we are gonna ignore that one and we're gonna focus on these instead. And these have definitely all been read kind of as an adult, aside from 2 of the books, but I'm gonna get cracking with the more classics first for you. So this first one actually I'm really excited about, because this was the first classic that I ever read and I felt very excited to have read it. And I can't remember how old I was when I read this, maybe like 18, because we don't tend to study classic literature in this sense in high school in the UK. Like, we'll study things like Of Mice and Men and we'll study some Shakespeare, but we don't study like kind of the Gothic literature or like 18th, 19th century literature. So this was like my first foray into that, and I felt very accomplished and I felt very like proud of myself that I had read and enjoyed a classic book. And that one is Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. And actually, interestingly, I'm studying this for my degree this semester. I'm very interested to come at it from a academic kind of perspective rather than just reading it for enjoyment. But this one just captured my heart and just captured the magic for me that is the Brontë sisters, and that also I feel like I get from Austen as well. I'd never obviously experienced that before reading this, and I think growing up in the northwest of England as well, where a lot of these books are set in the northwest, you know, a lot of them are set in the moors up in Yorkshire and in Leeds and that kind of way. So I feel like I could just greatly relate to the landscape and the gloom and just the aesthetic that Emily Brontë was trying to kind of communicate in this book. And this was the first book where I really kind of like could properly picture the setting and could really imagine myself in that. I think, you know, because growing up in a similar area, in a similar environment, it was very easy to transport myself. So I think that was kind of like a really intrinsic part of me loving and enjoying this novel so much. But I was just absolutely swept up in this story and in the mood of it, and oh, it was just fantastic. And although I literally haven't picked it up since, like I haven't picked this up since the first time I read it, I am very, very excited to delve back in and try it again from a different mindset. Similarly, another book that has just kind of captured my heart and I've been obsessed with since I was, I want to say, like 14, 15 years old, and that's Macbeth by Shakespeare. This is my favourite Shakespeare. I have a few that I like. It's definitely like almost a tie between this and A Midsummer Night's Dream, actually, because A Midsummer Night's Dream holds a very special place in my heart. I studied it a lot in drama in high school, and then we actually took part in this huge like drama festival where a load of different high schools all put on a different Shakespeare, and we got to perform it in a professional theatre setting, and we did not Macbeth, sorry, we did A Midsummer Night's Dream. So that does have a very like sweet and wholesome part in my heart, but Macbeth is just the one that just captured it and ran with it. And from the very first moment that I read Macbeth in school, I've just been completely captivated by this story. I love it. I love how dark it is. I love how it examines the very darkest parts of human nature. I love how Lady Macbeth is like the OG unhinged woman. I love her so much. And yeah, it's just a very, very incredible play for me. I love the kind of supernatural elements. There's just a lot about it that really, really appeals, and I've read it quite a lot as an adult. I'm actually doing a project right now that relates to Macbeth, and I'm not going to say anything more about that on this channel for quite some time because it's going to take quite some time to complete. But it's this book and me, this book just sits here. This book sits here in my heart, and if anyone's wanting to get into reading Shakespeare and anyone's wanting to try and like kind of dip their toe in reading kind of classics, I personally think this is a great place to start because it's captivating. It's got supernatural elements, it's got murder, it's got intrigue, it's got political manoeuvring, it's got an unhinged female like protagonist. It's so good. And it's definitely one that is just going to keep you completely spellbound whilst you're reading it. It's not a play that you're going to get bored of. And I also think as well, like, it's very interesting reading something like Shakespeare because obviously the language that's used in Shakespeare is very different to what we're used to speaking, you know, in contemporary England or modern times. And I still think you can understand what he's trying to say in Macbeth very, very easily, even without having like a knowledge of, you know, Elizabethan English, basically. Whereas I think some of the other plays are slightly less accessible. I think this one, Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream, are like kind of the easiest. Twelfth Night actually also is pretty easy. I read Othello recently and I really enjoyed Othello. But yeah, I recommend highly picking up Shakespeare, and especially Macbeth, if you are getting into wanting to dip your toe into the classics. Two classics as well that really started my obsession and my love were Pride and Prejudice and also Jane Eyre. So this is by Jane Austen and this one is by Charlotte Brontë, so obviously the sister of Emily Brontë. So this one again is set in the kind of Yorkshire moors. It's very atmospheric. Again, all of these books very, very dark, very, very atmospheric, and this one just has one of my favourite female protagonists of all time because Jane Eyre is just so strong. She doesn't take any shit from anybody. She is not interested in a life that doesn't make her happy, and she literally will just sit there and be like, you know what, no, this isn't serving me, and so I'm not here for it. And I love that about her, and I love that no matter what she goes through in her journey, she still doesn't lose sight of what she wants and doesn't lose sight of like staying true to herself. And I think the time when this was written, it was very rare for women to kind of have that autonomy over their own lives, and I think for Jane to be portraying that, just, I think it would have been a fantastic read at the time, and I think it probably would have given a lot of women a lot of comfort at that time. As you can see, this is my very highly annotated copy because I did read this for university last year, and yeah, I annotated it to death. I really did. The other reason I feel like I really identify with Jane is there is a lot of discussion of grief and loss, and unfortunately that is kind of like a very central theme to my life, so love that for me. But also she's obsessed with books, And I think anytime I read a female character that is kind of deeply obsessed with books, I think I always feel like an affinity to them, and that's one of the reasons why I connected with this so much. I actually read this pretty much straight after reading Pride and Prejudice, and definitely the two, you know, although set at kind of the same time in very similar locations and written by very similar authors, there is definitely a difference. This is definitely considerably darker, and it, you know, confronts a lot of deeper topics and darker themes, whereas this is much more light-hearted. This is kind of like the original blueprint for what we read as a rom-com now, for our kind of modern romance books. This was also one of the first books I annotated, as you can tell, because I mean, what the hell is this? But I remember reading this and finding this way more accessible than I thought I was going to, because I hadn't read a classic for quite some time before I picked this up. This was my first kind of like toe dip back into the world of classic literature, and I wasn't expecting to really enjoy it as much as I did, but I really did. Like, I thoroughly loved every single second of it. I found this one a lot funnier than I imagined, and culturally relevant even to today, which I also wasn't expecting. I wasn't expecting to be able to draw so many parallels between like our contemporary society and then the society that Elizabeth Bennet was living in this. So yeah, both of these are fantastic books. I realise I'm not giving you the plots for any of these, and I probably should, but at the same time I kind of want you to just go and experience them for yourselves and to kind of discover them and research them for yourselves, because I think that's sometimes the beauty of discovering books like this. I don't know. But yeah, these, both of them just hold such an incredibly special place in my heart, and I absolutely adore them with my whole heart. But I will say the classic that's probably captured my heart the most, and the one that I think has changed my life the most, and the one that I don't think I'll ever get over, and I think will forever be my favourite book of all time, is actually War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. This is also my most annotated book ever. Like, I went to town on this one. I was actually going to vlog my reading of this for YouTube, and then eventually I decided to do it on TikTok instead, and actually my first video reading this kind of went semi-viral, and that was kind of my greatest achievement of social media. It's got like nearly 100,000 views, and although it's taken like a year for it to get 100,000 views, I'm like, that still counts for me, okay? This book honestly chewed me up, spat me back out again, at a completely different person that I was when I first started reading it. I was like a shell of my former self. It was just honestly, truly the most incredible work of fiction I've ever read, the most incredible depiction of humanity. This book is the human experience wrapped up in like 1,400 pages, and you don't read this novel, you kind of experience it alongside these characters. And because this is set over the course of like 10 years, the character development and the growth that we see is just absolutely second to none. I've never read a book with better characters, more fleshed out characters, more emotionally deep and mature and believable characters. It's incredible. But this is obviously set in Russia, and it basically follows the war between Russia and Napoleon in the, I want to say the 1800s, and there's a lot of talk on kind of just like Russian society. So on the one hand, there's basically this like metaphor, right, for the theatre of war that runs throughout the whole book, but it's really funny because while the theatre of war is in the literal sense the war that is going on and how that can be compared to like just general theatrics, it's also heavily compared to the theatrics of the social circle that the women are experiencing. So while the men are at war, the women are also kind of like at war with each other, but over completely like nonsensical things. And it's just, it's so well done, and it's so interesting, and you care so much about these characters and what they go through and who they marry. And oh my god, I remember in one scene, I was reading it at like 2 AM and I wanted to throw the book across the room because I was just so like emotionally involved in this character arc that was happening, and I just couldn't fathom what was going on the page, and I lost my mind. I was like, this is actually insane. Like, oh, I love it so much. One of my favourite book boyfriends of all time is in this book. Prince Andrei just like has my heart and soul. I love it. I love it so much. The writing's incredible. Just the literary devices, the language choices, everything is just second to none in this book. And honestly, if I'm going to urge you to pick any of these books up, this one's the one that I'm going to urge you to pick up the most. I've kind of decided that my life's work is going to be dedicated to getting a whole new generation reading War and Peace, because I personally feel like it is the greatest book of all time ever written, and I will die on that hill. until I read something potentially better, but I don't think it exists. I think this is the pinnacle of literature for me. I adore it so much, like so freaking much. So next up we have like more modern classics. And there's one book that I would love to have included in this, but actually my auntie, I lent her my copy of it and she lost it. And I actually bought a replacement copy of it this year, but it's in America. And I didn't think to bring it back with me because I knew I wasn't going to read it at Christmas. So anyway, the reason I'm saying that is because it kind of links into this book. I'll talk about this one first. So this is On the Road by Jack Kerouac. And this is a very interesting choice for me to include here because I actually didn't really enjoy this book in the sense of I struggled through it. And I read it mostly because our Lord and Saviour Matthew Timothy Healy of the 1975 is obsessed with On the Road by Jack Kerouac. And anything that Matty recommends to read I will try and pick up, aside from Infinite Jest, because that just terrifies me, but one day it will happen. So anyway, this was basically my first kind of introduction to the Beat era. And although I didn't love this book, I have a very deep appreciation for it nonetheless, because I think that was a very defining moment, a very defining era in literature and art and just general culture in America. And so therefore I still try to consume as much as I can from that era, because even though the book may not be something that I personally enjoy, I still think it's incredibly culturally relevant. And I think as somebody who is a huge fan of literature and who's a huge fan of writing as an art form, I want to involve myself in that as much as possible and read as much from it and understand it, even if it's something that doesn't necessarily work for me. Another example of this is Last Exit to Brooklyn by Hubert Selby Jr., which I also bought as another kind of defining Beat era piece of literature. And again, I didn't love it, but I respect it so much for what it was doing and for the message it was trying to put across, because that was kind of the seedy underbelly of Brooklyn, New York, and it was kind of examining subcultures and that, and like sex and just illicit behaviour at the time. This is less so. This is just kind of a coming of age tale following a guy who finishes college and just goes on this road trip, the Great American Road Trip. The reason that this didn't work for me, I think, as a novel is just simply the fact that this is written in stream of consciousness, and that's just something that I generally do struggle with, because although there is, I guess, a very definitive narrative throughout, you know, it's got plot points, it's got a beginning, middle and end, it's just not done in the same way that like a more contemporary piece of work is written in. And I struggled with it, but I think this is one that I do want to revisit. I've only read it once and I do think it is one that I want to read again. But yeah, the reason I wanted to bring this up in conjunction with the book that I haven't got with me is that is Just Kids by Patti Smith, and that is a memoir of Patti's journey to New York and her becoming a key component of the beat scene in the 60s in New York. So that's her and her relationships with artists and photographers, her kind of discovering her own artistic capabilities, the kind of art that she wants to make, the kind of musician that she is. She discovers her sound, she discovers her vibe, she falls in love. And it's a very good book, and it's the first memoir I think that I ever really recall reading that made such a huge impression on me. And I just was captivated by it, and it just kind of works hand in hand with this. I think, like I've said, the beat movement was so defining for artists and writers and musicians, and it's just something that I think that we all still need to read from and immerse ourselves in some way. Yeah, I'm gonna stop. Then we have the one book out of this entire video that I've probably spoken about the most on the internet and social media, and I feel like people may have expected me to include this in this video, and that is The Great Gatsby. So this is the first copy of it I ever had and the one that I read, but actually for my 30th birthday my friends bought me a Penguin 1950s first edition copy of Gatsby. And I'm scared to take it out of this protective cover because I do not want to hurt it. This is one of my greatest possessions ever. And this will be coming back to the States with me because it is so special. But I'm going to put that down so it doesn't keep crinkling. I adore this book. It just, again, kind of captured the magic of the 1920s for me. And I am low-key obsessed with the 1920s. I feel like I was born in the wrong generation. My grandma was actually born in the 1920s, late 1920s. And I've always been fascinated by the fashion, the music, the lifestyle, that kind of age of indulgence just before the Great Depression. But that era of indulgence and just opulence, just it fascinates me and I love it so much, and especially in relation to the United States, because you guys know I have a very long and enduring love affair for America, and that is why I have uprooted my life and pushed it to the other side of the Atlantic so that I can live there. So this for me is just that kind of defining piece of work of that era and that generation. I love Fitzgerald. I've read a lot of his works and this one is my favourite. I love the story of Gatsby. I love the kind of love affair between him and Daisy, and I love the depiction of that obsessive love that Gatsby has for Daisy, and it's just fantastic. It's just a wonderfully written piece of work. I love how it's very small and digestible as well. Like if you are just wanting to get into classic literature and perhaps really classic literature isn't for you, then something like this, a more modern and contemporary classic, could be the one. But this is often considered the great piece of American literature, the great American novel, and I completely get it. It says on the back of this copy, it's one of the greatest works of American literature, a timeless evocation of allure, corruption and the carelessness of wealth. And yeah, pretty much sums it up. I absolutely adored this, and I know it maybe makes me like a bit of a basic bitch because everybody loves Gatsby, but I'm happy to make this like my entire personality. Between this and War and Peace, like that's all you need to know about me, honestly, as a human. Then we have a very contentious piece of literature, because I always feel weird including this on my list of favourites simply because the subject matter is so dark and so disturbing, but also this book is so beautifully written and it really does mess with your head when you're reading it, and that is Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. For anyone that doesn't know, this is about a guy called Humbert Humbert who I think is in his like 50s, maybe. And anyway, he falls in love with his landlady's 12-year-old daughter, who he calls Lolita. And it's basically the story of him falling in love with her and then acting on his desires. And it's done in such a way that firstly it puts you into the mindset of him, which is very disturbing in the first place considering he's, you know, a grown-ass adult man in love with a 12-year-old. But it also starts to make you sympathise with him, and I think that's the scariest thing because it really does play with you psychologically when you read. And then when you finish you're like, I need Jesus and therapy. But I just love this book. I love the way it was written. I just think it's absolutely incredible, and although like I say the subject matter is awful and very, very disturbing, it's also inspired a lot of great works of contemporary literature. Case in point, My Dark Vanessa, which I reread earlier on this year, and I kind of compare it often to A Little Life because it gives me the same absolute trauma that A Little Life gives me. And also I feel like with A Little Life, I think I can only read it a handful of times in my life without being, you know, permanently scarred. But I loved it. I truly did, and I love the original so much. Actually, one of my favourite bars in Miami is called Dolores, but you can call me Lolita, and it's obviously based upon this book because his landlady's daughter's real name is Dolores. But I do recommend picking this up. Just obviously go into it knowing what the subject matter is. That's why I kind of spoke a little bit more about the plot with this one, because it isn't one that you can kind of go into blind. You do need to know because hella trigger warnings. But it was yeah, it was quite something, and it's one that's always just kind of stayed in my mind as like a pinnacle of like how beautiful writing is and how talented authors can be, being able to make you sympathize with those kind of monstrous characters and being able to get you to appreciate those kind of monstrous characters. And it's just, yeah, it's kind of the magic of writing, isn't it, to be able to do that. I don't know, so good. Then we have American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. This is, I think, possibly the first piece of kind of contemporary classic literature I read as an adult, maybe. And this obviously follows Patrick Bateman, our Wall Street tycoon wannabe kind of guy, and his awful murderous spree across New York City. And I kind of feel like this is like a bit of a metaphor, extended metaphor for the American dream and its corruption and its materialism. It's just a very, very good book, and the way that Bret Easton Ellis writes is just completely captivating. This is obviously also very satirical, I will say that, and if you've watched the film, I think you possibly get the satire a little bit more than you do when you read it. I've read it a couple of times, and I think the first time I read it I didn't get the satire, and then the second time I read it I was like, oh, okay, I get this now. But honestly, it's fantastic. It's just kind of makes you really examine your own relationship with capitalism and kind of consumption, and that desire to always be better and be seen as better, and then, you know, the darkness that that can kind of bring out in a human. American Psycho is one of the most controversial and talked about novels of all time. A multi-million copy bestseller hailed as a modern classic, it is a violent black comedy about the darkest side of human nature. I have read a few more Bret Easton Ellis's books since, and none of them have quite captured me in the way that this did. I think this just is his like seminal work, and it's fantastic. And then finally, 2 books that I read as a child, and these really are the books that ignited my love of fantasy fiction, both by the same author. The first is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, and I read this when I was, I want to say 7 in school. We did it as like a guided reading thing, and I absolutely loved it. I inhaled it. I was captivated by Bilbo Baggins and his adventures with the dwarves and Gandalf and Smaug and all the way to the mountains. It was just, yeah, I loved it. And this is very much, I think, written for kids. This is very much like a kid's fantasy novel, and I think it's very digestible as a child. But then I also decided to try and read The Lord of the Rings. This is my original copy of Lord of the Rings. You can see how battered it is. I love it. This has like all 3 in one. You need like a microscope to see the text. And I read this shortly afterwards. So I read this when I was 7, and then I read this when I was 11. I was a little bit older. I got it when I was 7, but it was just, I think at that point, a little bit too much. I couldn't digest the world building. But I just honestly truly adored this book so much. I remember being such a little nerd. I used to like, because this has the appendices in the back, and you've got all of like the hobbits and the elves and the dwarves family trees, and you've also got like a guide on how to speak Elvish. And I remember sitting in my bedroom at like 11 or 12 trying to learn how to speak trying to learn how to speak Elvish, and then wondering why I had no friends in school. Because I was just like that kid trying to speak Elvish to people. But yeah, I loved it so much. I think it took me probably the best part of like 6 months to get through. It took me forever to read because I was quite young, I think, to read it, maybe. I don't know. And I think also because of the size of the text didn't help me as an 11-year-old, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. Again, I was just absolutely captivated by the adventure, and I love the world building and the fantasy creatures, and I just became so obsessed with this that I was like a bottomless pit of Lord of the Rings trivia for a very, very long time. And although I'm definitely not as an adult any longer, because my brain just doesn't seem to retain the information in the same way, this book still remains one of my favourites of all time. And the beautiful thing is, all of my friends are equally as enamoured and obsessed with the Lord of the Rings, so we are huge nerds, and we will happily soak up like any and all Lord of the Rings related information, TV shows, adaptations, whatever. We absolutely adore it. So yeah, I love that it's something that's carried into my adult life, and I feel like this book is kind of the pinnacle of a book that changed me and the fundamental like genetic makeup of me. It's, yeah, I actually have another 2 editions of this on my bookshelves. Hang on. Okay, well, I don't know where the second one is, but I do have the 100th anniversary edition here, and it came boxed. My mum got me this for Christmas last year, and I want to try and transport it across the States with me, but it's really heavy, so I need to like pick the right time. But this is the most beautiful book that I own. Look at this. It's got lovely foiling on the cover, and then sprayed edges. I have the text from The One Ring in the language of Mordor. And then inside you've got all the maps that are like hand illustrated. And it's so unbelievably beautiful. I absolutely adore this edition of it so much. And it's actually got lots of like coloured text in it as well. It's so beautiful, but I'm trying to like not touch it too much because I don't want to ruin it. But I love this book so much. Anyway, my friends, I really hope you've enjoyed that. I don't know if I've done these books justice. I'm kind of out of practice of like talking about these books in particular, because a lot of them I've not read for a very, very long time, and maybe I should have sat and kind of researched more about them. But also I kind of wanted it to be authentic and for you to just get like my opinions talking about them in the moment, rather than it being too scripted, because I feel like sometimes, although that can be good when you're trying to impart information, I do also feel like sometimes scripted videos can kind of lack that little bit of authenticity. And I think when you're talking about books that you're very passionate about and books that have changed you as a human, it's the authenticity that you want to see rather than me reading from a script, I like to think. But let me know anyway, I would appreciate the feedback. But this was very fun to film. It was very fun to just be reconnected with these books. I love them all so, so much. Other books I think I could have included in this, the Mortal Instruments series. I read that when I was in my very, very early 20s, and it was kind of my first foray into young adult fantasy, and I really enjoyed it. I remember sailing through it and just being like, wow. And then the Divergent series as well is another one, and the Fallen series by Lauren Kate, is that her name? That series actually was great. That was my first, like, I guess, like vampire supernatural type YA series, aside from Twilight. Twilight again is another one that's probably up there, you know, but they're all like the typical like YA fantasy and dystopian books that everybody was obsessed with, so I don't feel like they necessarily changed me as a human. I just think they were just what was in at the time and what I enjoyed reading. We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lionel Shriver. That book changed me a lot. That book horrified me. That lives rent-free in my mind, and I again would have included it, but I lent it to somebody and I can't remember who, and I never got it back. So The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath is another one that I would have included on here. I don't know, there's been a lot, but these books are the books that are like me. In True Blood by Truman Capote, there's another one. No, sorry, these books are like the books that are like me, you know, they're the ones that just like live in my soul, that I think about on the regular, and that I would just read again and again and again and again and again, and I would also kill to be able to read for the first time again. But that really is it from me. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. If you have, let me know. Don't forget to leave a comment below. Let me know like what the books are that have changed you as a human. I would love to know like what books really like live in your soul. And of course, if you're new, please don't forget to subscribe. I will see you in another video very soon. Bye friends.